What's up, everybody? In today's video, I'm going to be sharing a trip that I had that changed my beliefs for a very long time. And then I'm going to talk about how things played out after that. And towards the end of the video, we're going to get into a discussion about the different things that I believed after this trip and what that all looks like, generally speaking, from like a religious, spiritual perspective. And I'm going to share about the things that I learned and how I changed since that initial trip that I had. So, okay, getting into the trip itself, this was with DMT, and I had shared briefly about this in the first video that I made on the risks of psychedelics, but I'm going to go into more detail here. So I started off by taking my couple hits of DMT, and the room that I was in, as I started to go under, I wasn't completely under yet, but as I was starting to go under, the room around me started to become like grown over with like vines and plants, and everything covered with like, you know, like living, like almost breathing plants. And I started to slip under. And then what happened from there was the vines and the plants that were covering the room covered my entire body. And my perspective shifted outwards, so I was seeing my body, and everything about like my physical makeup was like basically made up of these vines and these plants. And so then as I went further under, I went into first the outer layers of my body, like my skin, my organs, and then I went into my bloodstream, basically. Like it the perspective and like where I was traveling was going through my bloodstream. So I was seeing the inside of the veins themselves, and I was seeing the blood surrounding me as I was like in my like actual veins. And then I kept going further into basically like the makeup of my body, and I literally went into the cells of my body, and I went into a single cell. And so then after I was in like the center of one of my cells, I see, and like I'm seeing like the cell walls. Forgive me if you see me, you know, grappling for words. You're probably going to see that a lot when I'm sharing these psychedelic experiences, because it's quite hard to explain. But I'm seeing the walls of my cell, and I'm also seeing like in the center of my cell, it looks like space basically. And it looks like I'm like looking through like a galaxy. And then I see in the distance this like little ball of light as I'm in this galaxy within my cell of my body. And I start getting closer and closer. And I want to mention before I go on and explain what that little ball of light was that I went into this psychedelic experience, which I've explained in the previous videos about psychedelics, where when I was at this point in my life, I was basically like seeking for answers about like who God was, what like the purpose of life was. Not the purpose of my life in particular, but just like the purpose of life, of being alive, of, you know, of humans, of like, you know, just the nature of how everything works. I wanted answers about that. So I went into this experience seeking that, and I had also turned my back on the beliefs that I had had leading up to that point. So I was basically like looking for answers as to like who God was, what the meaning of life was. So as I approach that little ball of light that's like in this galaxy in space, as I'm within the cell of my body, I start getting closer and closer, and I see that it's the earth. And in this unspoken dialogue that happens in psychedelic experiences, especially really powerful ones like DMT and ayahuasca and stuff, there's like this communication that was going on that was not from me. It was, like a dialogue that was being spoken. And it said, like, you wanted to know who God was and what God was. Here it is. And so as I approach this little ball of light, I see that it's the earth. And I see that what's creating that light is basically every human, every plant, every animal, every living thing that is on the earth, in this psychedelic experience was like giving off, emitting a little beam of light. And all of those little beams of light from every living thing combined were creating the light of everything that was on this earth in this vision, that was making everything like glow from afar. And so I was seeing in this that like every living thing and the internal dialogue communication that was going on in this trip was that, this is God. You are God. Every plant is God. Every animal is God. Everything in nature is God. And you are all facets of the divine. And that in this vision, I was seeing that all of these facets, that each and every living thing on the earth are creating, are showing this, are shining this light, basically, that creates, that all of us together, everything creates God. And it was so profound. And after that, I slipped slowly out of where I was. And as I was waking up, I said it as I was waking up from the being under on the DMT. I said, like, I am amazing. You are amazing, to my husband who I was with at that time. And I said, you are amazing. I am amazing. And he was like, okay, yeah, I know, just kind of joking around. But I meant it in this deeper way of like, I had this like revelation, and I believed in the fiber of my being that I had been shown who God was. And I believed in the fiber and the cells of my being that everything that I had known before, all of my beliefs from when I was a child and as I got older, and my personal relationship that I had with God over the years, and my connection to all of that was basically, it was, I didn't discredit it, but I looked at it as like a stepping stone to this like higher knowing, and this basic, like, I believed that I was enlightened by this information that was communicated to me in this psychedelic experience. And it was so profound, and it was so very life-changing. And if you're watching these psychedelic videos, the last video that I made about the experience where I interacted with that being that gave me a review of my life, that last video was like years after this experience that I'm sharing in this video. This was one of my very first DMT experiences. And it was so completely life-changing. And it changed the course of my life. It changed the course of my beliefs up until that point. And I really thought, you guys, that like I had received some sort of enlightenment from it. So that was my experience, and I tried to explain it as best as I could. These psychedelic experiences that I share in these videos are well over 10 years ago at this point. And this one in particular today is approaching 15 years probably. So I appreciate you, hanging with me as I'm trying to articulate these things. Not only have I very seldom explained them before and put them into words before, but it's also, the amount of time that's passed, it's interesting, to say the least, to explain these things. So I appreciate you sitting with me as I grapple for my words. So, okay, moving on. What happened from here? Like I said, this was in the beginning of the reintroduction of psychedelics in my life, because I had been into them when I was in my teens, and I laid them to rest in my early 20s for a handful of years, and then they crossed my path in like my mid 20s again. And when I was using them when I was in my teens, it was more of a recreational thing. It was more just a part of like the scene that I was in, growing up in like the hippie Grateful Dead scene. So when I had gotten into them again in my 20s, like I was using them looking for like deeper meanings. And when I thought that I received those deeper meanings, and when I thought that I received this like enlightenment, it really impacted my life. So moving forward, everything changed with what I believed. I was working at a hippie cafe at the time that was very like progressive and into like left-wing politics, and they were all about like, they had a bunch of flags hanging out in front of the cafe of like different countries' flags, and then they had like one of those like coexist, if you've ever seen those bumper stickers, one of those coexist flags that's like the coexist word is made up of all of like the different religious symbols from around the world. And that was like part of the mentality of this place, where like it was just a very accepting in a lot of ways of like different lifestyles and beliefs and all of that kind of stuff. And so I was working at this place, and it was in the neighborhood that I still live in to this day, which is I probably like 5 years ago or so I checked. I haven't checked recently, but 5 years ago, this neighborhood that I live in is the most diverse per capita area of like the United States. So like we have all different religions, we have all different ethnicities, people from everywhere, every walk of life live in this neighborhood that I'm in. And I love that for so many reasons, but I'm kind of painting a picture of like the place where I was living when I had this experience, because it really played into how much this changed my life and impacted my life. Because to me at that time, like it made perfect sense, it made perfect sense that like, why would one religious or spiritual path be the only way? Why would, if there was a God, he create all of these different cultures and all these different beliefs if like, they weren't all valid in some way? And I live in this, super diverse area where like, why when I look at like a Hare Krishna, chanting and walking down the street, or I look at an Indian person, or I look at, a Jamaican person, or, all of these different beliefs, I look at a Buddhist person, like, why is one belief better over the other? Like everything is completely valid. And so when I saw this vision too of that, like, okay, like God isn't our creator. We are all God. We are all creating God. So I looked at everything and everyone basically as like, that we are all reflections, facets, not reflections. We are all facets of the divine, like I was shown in this psychedelic DMT trip that I had. And it played out even further than that. Like I started explaining how the beginning of this trip, like the whole room became covered in plants and vines. And then I became, basically made of plants and vines. And that was really profound for me. That started off my interest in studying herbalism. And I was also smoking a ton of weed at the time, where like I had quit drinking probably like a few years prior to that point. And I had used weed like heavily during all of this. And I wasn't physically addicted to alcohol, but I was using it to cope with difficult things that I was going through in my life. And when I removed that like self-medicating coping mechanism, weed became like a big part of my life. And one of the reasons why I ended up in a bad way with alcohol was because what I was going through in my life, like when I would open my eyes in the morning, I would literally have panic attacks and like facing the reality of what was going on in my life. And so alcohol became this like coping mechanism of like, just basically like trying to deal with what was going on. So instead of that, and when I removed that coping mechanism, I just started smoking like hella weed, like basically from the moment that I woke up until the moment I went to bed, I was smoking weed like every at least couple 3 hours at the most. And it was my coping mechanism. And so that was playing into, I think, like my mentality after having this trip, and then, seeing basically that like, plants are God. And I've said it before that like I was made to worship God. I was made to worship our Creator. So when I removed myself out of that equation of worshiping God, I had this big, like, I've heard it said as like a God-shaped hole in our hearts that we all have, that we don't even recognize that we have. And I had a huge God-shaped hole in my heart that I was looking to fill with whatever I could. And just going through life and not having any like beliefs or meaning in anything didn't work for me. Because like I had shared before, like I had experiences when I was super young where I had a couple near-death experiences where I knew from the jump that there was more to this life and there was more to this existence than what we see in these material realms and just going to work and like paying bills and all that kind of stuff. Like I knew that there was a deeper meaning of life. And so when I had this experience and I had this vision, I ended up like it changed my perspective as far as like what I believed. And like I looked at it like, we are all God, like the namaste thing, like the divine in me recognizes the divine in you, and all plants are God. If plants are God, if plants are a facet of the divine, of God, if we all create God, then why isn't weed God? Why aren't, psychedelic mushrooms God? Why aren't, why isn't, DMT, which is like a synthesized version of, basically like ayahuasca, which is rooted in plants. Why isn't it all God? Why aren't we all God? So it set the tone and it set the path for how my life played out for a solid 15 years, where I then moved on and I just got so deep into these beliefs, you guys. Like I studied herbalism, and I didn't just study like the medicinal uses of plants. I studied a type of, I guess you would call it herbalism. I don't know. It's not herbalism in a traditional sense. I studied traditional herbalism, but I also studied what's called plant spirit medicine, which is a type of working with plants where it's the belief that every plant has its own unique spirit. And through working with these plants, meaning like developing relationships with them by using them, by processing them into different like herbal preparations, and by either sharing or recommending them with others, that we build these like relationships and with these plants, and they become allies. And so I was into, yes, the like, traditional medicinal aspect of herbalism, but I was like going deep with this other stuff. And like, mind you, I'm doing like a bunch more psychedelics after that initial experience. And I'm also smoking a bunch of weed. So I'm just like in this state of mind where I'm just like this like goofy spun out hippie, like, you know, like talking with plants, not like talking out loud, but like, you know, communicating with plants and like making these herbal preparations where I'm like, you know, setting intentions and like praying over these like, you know, different herbal things that I'm making, and like playing like different like sound healing from like my herbal preparations, and like different I just went so far, you guys. I was such a freaking weirdo. So that was like how the stuff with plants went on. Like what went on with the beliefs with as far as like seeing God and everybody and all people was that like ultimately what happened was that like I looked at myself like I was God. And so that ended up playing out in a very bad way, and we're going to get into how that played out in a moment. But just to kind of like wrap up like how things unfolded, where like it was a big deal, you guys, like how much this affected me. And I wanna, before we go on, I wanna just emphasize that like this stuff wasn't just happening like in these actual psychedelic trips, but like this was playing out in my everyday waking life, as far as like the reality of this psychedelic vision that I had, and like this belief that God is me, God is you, God is every plant, God is every animal. It's like literally playing out throughout my life. And I mean, just another little psychedelic trip story thing that emphasizes this is that I worked in Northern California in Humboldt County for a lot of years, where I was working in the medical cannabis industry. I would go out there and work on friends' weed farms during their harvest seasons. So what I would do is I would go out for between a month and two at the very most. And what I was able to do was through going out there, I was able to make enough money to live off of for the year. And this is when I had left my path working with food, because I had gone to culinary school before. Food has always been my calling. It's what I do now. But as my life kind of unfolded in this way, and like I'm like studying herbalism, I have this opportunity to go and do the harvest seasons at a friend's farm. I'm like, sure, let's do it. You know, awesome. And so I'm out in the ancient redwoods of Northern California and Humboldt County, which are still some of my favorite places in the world. But I was in this ancient redwood forest where the trees are so big you can literally like drive a car through the center of one of them, just to give you like a idea of like the scale of these things. And these trees are just like, even still to this day, like I am in awe of these trees. And so like I explained a little bit about like how I am with plants and stuff at this point, and I'm just like geeking out on this whole like, you know, plant spirit medicine stuff, and like believing that each plant has its own like consciousness and spirit to it. And so I'm now at this point going out to the redwoods in California 2 times a year, and I'm staying out there for, you know, a month, 2 at a time. And it being in this environment of being in these ancient redwood forests, it's just like solidifying and playing into everything that I had believed from this psychedelic experience. And I had the chance to do some acid that apparently belonged to like some like old school like wrecking crew, Grateful Dead wrecking crew, which we're going to get into the whole Grateful Dead thing at another time. But just to kind of, you know, and this isn't going to make sense to you, I'm sure. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I apologize. But apparently it was some original like Stanley Mouse acid, which is the dude who was the chemist for the Grateful Dead, who created their acid and a lot of the acid in the scene at that time in like the 60s and 70s. And so apparently it was some Stanley mouse acid, and I had the chance to do some, and I did. And I got super spun out, and I literally like laid a blanket on the floor of the Redwood Forest, and I was by myself. The work season had finished, and I specifically had saved this acid for the end of this work trip that I was on. And I laid on this blanket on the floor of the Redwood Forest, and I took a decent amount too. So like I was super, super high. And with DMT, you don't go completely under. You're still like conscious of your surroundings and stuff with acid. So I'm literally laying on the floor of this Redwood Forest, and I laid there all day. That's how high I was. I maybe got up to, go pee or whatever, drink some water or something, but I was like laying there the whole day. And I'm looking at the time too of this video, and it's a long one again, so buckle up again. So I'm laying on the floor of this Redwood Forest, and I'm just like watching the sun move through the trees because I was laying there for so long, and I'm watching the birds, and I'm watching the trees, and like the branches of the redwood trees like swaying in the wind, and I'm watching the little redwood needles that come off of like the trees because they don't have leaves. They have like needles, kind of like pine needles, just like falling through the air and catching the light as they're falling to the ground. And there was like, to me at that time on that acid, this like intelligent communication that was going on. And it was just interweaving with everything that I had believed. And at this point, like I had that initial DMT experience, like maybe, I don't know, 5-6 years before. And so I'm just in deep in this stuff. And I'm literally feeling like there is this communication from the natural world around me, and the trees and the birds and the wind and me. And there's like this like coexistence and this interweaving and this connection between me and the natural world. And it was so profound, and I'll never forget it. But so yeah, that's what I want to emphasize before we move on, that like this stuff wasn't just in these trips. Like it was in everything that was going on in my life at that point. And as things go on, I keep going further and further into these beliefs. And this is my reality for 15 years, basically. So, okay, moving forward, how does it play out? Well, I mentioned a moment ago that like I believed that God was in everything. I believed that God was in those trees, and that God was in weed, and that God was in psychedelic mushrooms, and, any sort of living thing, any animal. I got into like spirit guides. I got into, plant spirit medicine, like I was explaining. But the biggest thing about it was that I thought that I was God. And so moving forward, and how this plays out is that belief was what almost destroyed me. Like all of these different beliefs that were a reflection of that psychedelic experience, the core one was that I am God. And why that almost destroyed me was because as I moved forward in these beliefs, I just became more and more prideful, and more detached from reality, and more thinking that I was the one who created my own reality, and that, I was manifesting, my destiny. And I was, the one who controlled my life, my existence, my prosperity, my abundance, my any aspect of my life. Like I thought that I was the one who controlled that. And so this ended up moving forward, and this is going to be the common theme in these videos that they're going to go into, and I won't emphasize as much because we just got into all that other stuff, but like these beliefs ultimately almost destroyed me, because I sit here before you now by the grace of God, really. But I was almost destroyed by these beliefs. Because at the end, what ended up happening was, as you know, like I ended up becoming helplessly addicted to kratom, which was a plant, which I thought that, God is kratom, kratom is God. And my guidelines for myself, my rules for myself were that because I had quit psychedelics 3 years before I started on kratom, not by choice, I just didn't have any more and I didn't find any more. But I ended up using kratom years later. And my guidelines were that I didn't put anything into my body that wasn't a unprocessed plant, or food. So sure, I was smoking a bunch of weed and I was drinking a ton of coffee. And then when kratom crossed my path, that was in line with what I believed. So I did it. And I can see as I look back, the descent way before the kratom came into the picture. I can see how my life started to fall apart. I can see how, through trying to manifest my destiny, I moved space and time to make something happen that was not meant to happen in my life. I was not meant to be in a certain line of work. I was not meant to move to a certain place. And I thought that I was manifesting my destiny, but really it was just literally like my path of destruction. And so I ended up at the end of all of this, like skin and bones, helplessly addicted to kratom, had made a mess of myself and my life. And, if you'd like to hear how everything played out, I have other videos where I go into it. But basically, I came to a reckoning where, like, I understood finally that, like, all of these beliefs that I had had for 15 years were not cool. And that they were ultimately like a huge deception. That at first, that vision that I had from psychedelics was so real, on the DMT, with like believing that everything was God and that I was God. It was so real. It was realer than, any other spiritual experience that I had ever had up until that point. But really what it was a very elaborate deception. And every single psychedelic experience that I had, and then as things played out in my waking life, like all of them were fine-tuned into what was going to deceive me. And the little things that pulled on my heartstrings about like different aspects of what I was shown, all of it was a deception and to deceive me and to bring me further on that path of destruction and further into my pridefulness and my arrogance by thinking that I was God. So, okay, moving forward, we're going to wrap our minds around like what all this means. So basically what these psychedelic experiences were and the beliefs that resulted from them are a spiritual stance and belief called pantheism. And what pantheism means, it's actually a Greek word. And pan means all, and theism means God. So it literally means that God is everything, everything is God. I got super cracked out on the whole sacred geometry thing. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, like the whole flower of life, where it basically like symbolizes that like everything is connected to everything. And this geometric design is actually the design that forms in the womb when the embryo is formed in the womb. It literally has the design of this like geometric pattern. The way that the galaxy and that universes are formed is also in this pattern. And so that was like one of the things that I got super into was sacred geometry for that reason. But that's what pantheism means, is that God is all is God. And in that, it's looked at like everything is connected in that kind of like, sacred geometry, flower of life sort of concept. And so these spiritual beliefs, they go back centuries, and there are reflections of it in many different religions and cultures around the world. So this isn't like a novel, new hippie thing that, is just coming about now. This is, something that comes from a long time ago. And that sort of added in a way to its validity to me. But like, so, pantheism, now that we have a name for it, like, what does that all mean? Why wouldn't it be valid? Why wouldn't this be like a real belief that makes sense? Well, the reason why, and obviously everybody has their own free will to choose what they want to believe, but like, ultimately, just like what it did to me, ultimately what's happening with this is that it is discrediting God as our creator, and it's making us all into God. And this is literally like a recipe for destruction. And you may be watching this and you may not be down with what I believe and the faith that I have come to understand and have as my foundation. And I'm totally respectful of that. And I'm not here to push anything that I believe on anybody. But I will say that any belief set aside, it doesn't matter, what your religious or spiritual preference is. Like, pridefulness is literally like, it literally will destroy you. And I think that is like the most ultimate form of pridefulness, is that believing that we're God. So like, it's up to you to decide like what you think about that. But like, okay, so like, how did things like end up moving forward from there? Because basically that's what it was, you guys. Like it was 15 years of pantheistic beliefs for me. And, now I'm at the point where like, when I turned away from those beliefs and I laid them to rest, I am now worshiping the creator, not the creation, because that's what happened. And, everybody has their choice to believe what they believe. And for me, going through all of those years of like thinking that I was God and thinking that plants were God, like seeing how it played out ultimately in destruction was so profound for me. And it really plays a big part in why I believe what I believe, because like if I'm left up to my own devices, I'm going to make a mess of my life. If I make my own beliefs, I'm going to get myself into the trouble that I got in. Yeah, sure, it took a long time. Yeah, sure, I was in those beliefs for so long, thinking that I was enlightened and thinking that I was God. And things were great for a little bit. And that's always how it is with these beliefs, is that there are these honeymoon phases where like, everything seems great and we think that we're having healing and enlightenment from these drugs, these psychedelics. But ultimately, when things play out over the course of years, they really lead to our destruction. And I understand that some people can see the benefits in these things. But like, what I ask is that like, give it 10 years, man. Give it 10 years and see how these things play out. And it may not be this like, huge, like, like destruction sort of situation that happened with me. But it may play out in like little things where like, these psychedelic experiences that we have can like lend to pridefulness, can lend to arrogance, can lend themselves to like, being like detached from reality, basically. Because that's what happens when you have these psychedelic experiences that are not like, they're not in reality. You are going to places and you are going to like spaces and you are doing different things and being in different like, states of mind. That's not reality. And then when you're allowing yourself to be influenced by them, like it detaches you from reality. And so there may not be this like really cut and dry where like with me, like where I had like a very defined, like basically like point of complete and utter destruction. It may not be like that. It may just be like, little things that are a part of your life that separate you, from our creator, and separate you from reality, and separate you from, doing the real work that needs to be done in your life, either through, just living it, or doing trauma work, or working on your relationships, or whatever it is. Like, these experiences are not helping with that. They're like moving you further away from that. So there it is, guys. There's another one of my experiences about my psychedelic experience that ended up in pantheism. And we had the chance to wrap our minds around it together. I encourage you to share your thoughts, your arguments in a chill, kind, respectful way, because if not, they're not going to be entertained. But yeah, let's start a conversation about this, because I've said before to you guys in my comments that, like, I was a staunch advocate for psychedelics. I preached from the rooftops that psychedelics had healed me, had healed my childhood trauma, had changed my life. And I was like that for 15 years. So I'm coming from that perspective. And I'm not here to say how you feel is wrong. But I would like to, maybe just create a dialogue, create a conversation where we can just bounce ideas off one another. And I can share what I've learned, you can share what you've learned, and that would be super chill. So thanks for watching, and we will continue on our psychedelic series in the future, in the near future. All right, see you then. Bye.